Welcome back. We're continuing along in our journey through the book of Matthew, and now we're on chapter 9. So here we've been exploring a bit of Jesus's works, his miracles that he's done over the last few chapters. We see that it just starts off with Jesus crosses over a sea and comes back to his town. So where is he now? What does that mean for us?
Yeah, Jesus has been over on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, which we learned in the last chapter was Gentile territory over there in the east. Now he's coming back to the west side, where many Gentiles did live, but it's also a more Jewish area as well. And when it says he came to his own town, that doesn't mean Nazareth, where Jesus grew up and lived his youth and early adulthood. It probably is a reference to Capernaum, which he appears to have made his home and kind of base of operations during his early Galilean ministry.
Okay, so that's where we are now. And we're continuing along with some more miracle stories. So it jumps right in with, we see a man who's paralyzed here. So we're going to do sort of the same method that we did before of noticing who is it, well, who's the person where the miracle happens, what was his need, and how does Jesus respond? So what are some of those answers right there?
Yeah, this is an interesting miracle story because this man has two problems that Jesus identifies and addresses both of those problems. One is his physical problem of some kind of paralysis. This is not the first time Jesus has dealt with paralysis. And the story of the centurion's servant that we had in chapter 8, the servant's malady was paralysis. But the interesting thing here is that Jesus first raises the problem of this man's need for the forgiveness of sins. Now, there's a little confusion in our study of this passage. Is it implying that the paralysis was a direct result and was linked somehow to a sin? Jews did tend to believe that physical problems were the result of some sin, or kind of a direct result. Jesus doesn't appear to teach that. In fact, appears not to teach that. In the Gospel of John, chapter 9, when they encounter a man in Jerusalem who is blind, the disciples say, okay, now who sinned, this man or his parents? And there that shows that the Jewish mindset tended to connect those two. And Jesus said, sin? What are you talking about? Nobody sinned here. The guy just is blind, So Jesus didn't buy into that. The question remains, is there a connection? I don't think there is. I think Jesus just identified that people can have physical challenges and they can have spiritual challenges in their lives. We've noticed who Jesus heals. In this case, it's a Jewish person back on the east side. It's a man, and he does have a physical ailment, paralysis, and he has sin in his life that Jesus wants to address as well. So Jesus demonstrates authority both over his physical illness and over his spiritual sin. And the reaction to this is very interesting, especially that the scribes, the teachers of the law, react to the forgiving of sins. And they accuse Jesus of blasphemy, saying only God can forgive sin. Of course, this indicates that the scribes have not accepted that Jesus is the Son of God.
Yeah, they even put him on that level.
Yeah, but Jesus is kind of hinting at the fact, well, I am the Son of God, so yes, I do what God does, which is forgive sins. The crowds, on the other hand, seem to be responding to the healing part of it and say they were filled with amazement and glorified God. While the scribes are accusing him of blasphemy, that is, defaming God, the crowds are glorifying God. So there's a real contrast in the reaction to this. We've been tracing Jesus' authority throughout the last chapter and in this chapter as well. And we start off here with a direct reference to authority so that you may know where are we? Verse 6, right? So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So Jesus himself is appealing to the divine authority.
Yeah, but he's declaring that right there.
Yeah.
Obviously. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our first miracle story we see. And then it sort of goes on to the theme of discipleship that we've seen so much intertwined here. So now we're in verses 9 through 13, and it talks about how he sees a man called Matthew. So that seems pretty significant. And while we're in the book of Matthew, what do you want us to notice as we look at this one?
Well, this is like chapter 8, the previous chapter, in that it's mainly a chapter of miracle stories, but right in not the very middle, but in the lineup of miracle stories, Jesus is dealing with people who want to be his disciples. And Matthew sneaks those discipleship stories in among the miracle stories because, for reasons we talked about in our last lesson, these miracle stories raise questions about the identity of Jesus. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? But they also raise questions about the nature of Christian discipleship as we emulate the ministry of Jesus. So we've got this discipleship story. So here's Matthew, believed to be the author of this gospel. And we see that he was doing his job, just like the fishermen followers, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They were busy about their...
They were doing their work.
They were doing their thing. And so is Matthew sitting at the tax collecting station. I think we've already talked in our opening lesson about the fact that he would have been a Jew hired by the Romans to collect taxes for the Romans from the Jews, and would have been hated and by the Jews. Jesus says the same thing to him that he says to other people, follow me. And he got up and he did the right thing. He followed it.
Yeah,
so that's how he begins the story. And then he wanted to thank Jesus for his encounter, so he invited him to a banquet at his house. He's probably a fairly wealthy person without a job like that. And he invited the only people who would come and hang out with him.
More tax collectors and sinners.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. So it's a party of sinners. Yeah.
That term sinners is kind of interesting there. I think we might put quote marks around sinners. I doubt if that's what Matthew would have called himself. But that is definitely what the Pharisees and the scribes thought of tax collectors.
That's how they would reference
They lumped them in that category. So tax collectors and, quote, other sinners. The translation that I'm looking at here has the word reclining with Jesus. That's a good translation. It's interesting. This is just a side note, but it's important to remember, I think, that people didn't sit at tables to eat in those days.
They're reclining,
Yeah, they're reclining on cushions with the food spread out in the middle, leaning on their left elbow, eating with their right hand, reaching in with their feet sticking out that way. That picture of how they ate will come to be important in some later stories.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
At any rate,
we see here it says that the Pharisees were judging them for this, and that Jesus responds by talking about how he desires mercy, not sacrifice. And that's a quote. So I remember you mentioning that's pretty significant. So tell us what does that bring to mind?
Very important quote. It's from the prophet Hosea, chapter 6, verse 6. And that word mercy is made, if you had to pick one word in the Old Testament to sum up the message of the Old Testament, it would be this word mercy. It's kind of like if you had to do that in the New Testament, you might pick agape, love, This word mercy is just very key. It describes God's love and care for God's people based on God's covenant promises to those people. And it's the response that God expects from his covenant people. He expects them to love and be loyal to him as part of this covenant. And it's the way that God expects his covenant people to treat other people. Mercy. It's a big concept. and a beautiful term. And here, when they accuse him of hanging out and socializing with and eating with sinners, he said, well, wait a minute. I thought, according to Hosea, this is exactly what God is like.
That's what God does.
I want mercy, not just ritual, which you all are good at.
Yeah.
But I want merciful merciful relationships with other people.
And we see that there's some important things that we notice about Jesus's agenda, his plan while he's on earth. I sort of jumped over how it says that those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. So he talks about being there for the sick. And what does that mean as he looks at caring for the sick?
Yeah, that's verse 12. Jesus is talking about the sick. Again, I think we could put that in quote marks. He doesn't just mean the physically ill. He means all those who are viewed as weak or less than or in need. And it may be a spiritual need. It may be an emotional need. It might be a physical need. But Jesus said, I came not for the people who have it all together. Maybe, you, scribes and Pharisees, don't need me as much as a tax collector does. And you need to respect that and celebrate that I've come to invite them into the kingdom. Then he goes on and reaffirms that at the end of this passage in verse 13, I have not come to call the righteous, that is, those who are already have their lives pretty much in line with God's will, but sinners, people who are
That's who Jesus
out of
is there
alignment.
for. Wow. Yeah. I love seeing that story. It's helpful for us to see the context of, the person who we think wrote this gospel and what that looks like for him. That just seems so important. As we continue on, we see another story about discipleship next. So that's in verses 14 through 17, and they ask about fasting. So how would you describe this little section here?
Yeah, this is not so much a teaching about fasting. Jesus gave us a teaching about fasting back in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 that we've already discussed. Here, the question is, why don't your disciples fast as much as we do? And the we in this case is the disciples of John the Baptist. And the Pharisees also fasted quite a lot. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a parable about a Pharisee and a publican, that is, a tax collector. And the Pharisee is standing up in the temple bragging about how religious he is. And one of the things he says is how often he fasts. So we know that was part of their religious life. But when they criticized Jesus' disciples for not being big into fasting, Jesus said, fasting is really an association is done in association with prayers for forgiveness. And so they're kind of a sad, it's a sad situation. He said, I'm with my disciples, they're with me, and we're celebrating. This is an occasion for joy. So he kind of redefines discipleship there as not just a matter of keeping ritual, religious activities like fasting. Not that there's anything at all wrong with it. Jesus himself implies that it's beneficial, but the joy is the proper response to being in a relationship with Jesus.
That Jesus is there with them. Yeah. Okay, yeah. And then we see, we'll go on to another big story that we have next in this chunk of scripture. So it's verses 18 through 26, where there's two miracles wrapped up in here, kind of happening at the same time. So we really want to spend a lot of time here as we unpack it. So tell us more about who we're looking at here, who's involved in this story.
Yeah, you're right. This is a double miracle story. And so the people who benefit from Jesus' healing are in some ways very different and in some ways alike. They are alike in that they are both Jewish. Okay. They are alike in that they are both female. Beyond that, the differences get pretty big. One is an older woman, not elderly necessarily, but a mature woman, and the other is a girl. Other Gospels tell us that she's about 12 years old. Matthew doesn't mention her age. The woman, the girl has died, and her father, who is a religious leader, probably right there in the town of Capernaum, comes to Jesus, eager for Jesus to come and heal her, raise her, deal with her. When he first comes, she's still living, but very sick. So this religious leader shows faith in Jesus, at least Jesus' ability to heal. What else he thinks of him, we're not quite sure. It's on the way there with his disciples that he is touched by this Jewish woman. And her situation is fascinating. It says that she has had a flow of blood for 12 years. Wow. Now, this is not a cut. This is menstruation, uncontrolled menstruation, which I can't even imagine. Must just be so debilitating and uncomfortable. I don't know how a man could ever possibly imagine that. I know I can't. So this is a dire situation. And what it has done is left her as a social outcast, a religious outcast. She has no source of income. She couldn't possibly work. She's cut off from her family. So we've already seen some people like this, like that leper, who was just cut off in every way.
It affects every aspect, not just the physical things we might think of today, but so much more beyond that. And this will be something that's read in this week's reading plan.
Okay.
I think you'll be in Leviticus 15. So it talks about what would happen when a woman had her period in general. So imagine here it is for 12 years, anyone who touches them is unclean. So to imagine anyone who touched this woman for 12 years being unclean, well, that means no one's probably around her. And to realize that impact of her life is very significant.
Yeah. Well, somehow we're kind of prepared for that with lepers, stories about lepers. They have to live outside of town. Anybody who touches them is equally unclean. They might not catch leprosy, but they catch uncleanness. And it turns out it's the same for a menstruating woman. And here, this woman lives her whole life with that situation going on. So this is a dire situation. I just love her boldness in reaching out to Jesus and touching him, at least the fringe of his cloak. And then I love Jesus' response. He turned to her. This is in verse 22.
Okay.
Take heart, my daughter, your faith has made you well. It's that word daughter just should ring in our ears, because what this was ostensibly was a miracle story about the religious leader's daughter who was dying back at their house.
Yeah.
That was the daughter we're supposed to care about. But Jesus stops in the middle of that and addresses this outcast woman as his daughter. And I just find that so beautiful.
He gives that label to her. That's beautiful. Yeah. I love seeing too how, we see in Leviticus that she's unclean. So if she touches anyone, that's what spreads, is the uncleanness or however you want to say that. And instead it's his touch that spreads, in a sense, his holiness, that he's able to heal her. And that just to me says something about the power of Jesus, and to use the word authority that we've been using, that that's what he has control over, rather than things that are unclean don't have more power than he does. He has more power than them.
Yeah. Well, eventually, after being so kind and compassionate toward this woman, Jesus does go on and raise the girl.
That's true.
He says she's not dead but sleeping. It's a little hard to tell how literal Jesus is being there. Has she not really died? They only thought she had died, and so he heals her. Or had she actually died? And he knows that he's going to overcome that. In a way, it doesn't matter. He gave the girl what she needed and showed his authority. perhaps not only over illness or disease, but over death itself, depending on what her actual condition was. Yeah. And these events caused quite a stir around the area. It says in verse 26 that report of this spread all over the area.
You can imagine why. I think this is the first time in this gospel where we see Jesus conquer death itself. Yeah. So it's not just a flashy miracle or something that could be confused with maybe the magicians at that age, but rather, wow, someone was dead, and that they see that she's raised to life. So these just some beautiful stories right there. We can go ahead on to the next one. We have some more healing stories. Jesus healing 2 blind men. So this is verses 27 through 31. So what do we see here? What jumps out to you?
Well, the people involved are 2 men. Okay. We had 2 women in the previous story. We have 2 men in this story. And they appear to be Jewish men. They use the language here, have mercy on us, son of David. So their cry brings us all the way back to the very first verse of the Gospel of Matthew, where we had the beginning of the story of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David. And that reminds us that Jesus fulfills the prophecy of the Messiah King. But as we've said before, Jesus' kingdom is way more than Israel. And so many surprising people are included in and invited into his kingdom. Well, having cried out for mercy. Oh, by the way, there's that word that I said.
Word mercy.
Yeah, it was so important, right? They know what the son of David should show them, mercy, and sure enough, he does. So he questions them about faith. Faith is important to Jesus throughout here, and he recognizes, back in chapter 8, he recognized the faith of the centurion, and he's recognized the faith of the hemorrhaging woman in the previous story. So, do you have faith? And they say, yes, Lord, we do. And so here he touched their eyes, there's touch. Sometimes Jesus uses physical contact and sometimes not.
Okay.
And here he does. And he says, according to your faith, that's what he said to the centurion, let it be done. So they were healed. Now, after the healing itself, Jesus does that thing where he tells them not to talk about it.
He once again says, see that no one knows of this. And that seems so surprising. And I just love how the next verse talks about, but they went away and spread the news about him through all of that district. So what do we want to learn from that?
Yeah, well, let me just remind people, we talked about this a little bit earlier, that I'm pretty sure that Jesus' habit of telling people that he healed not to run around and talk about it to everybody was because Jesus didn't want his identity as the Messiah to be based on his ability to heal.
Okay.
Healing was obviously a very important part of his ministry, and Matthew recognizes that. Whenever Matthew summarizes Jesus' ministry, he mentions teaching, preaching, and healing. So we're not suggesting that is in any sense unimportant.
We don't take that part out, but we don't make it the main thing.
Right, but you're right. But it is a reminder that Jesus didn't come just to do miracles. The miracles are a sign of the truthfulness of his teaching, and together his teaching and preaching and healing are signs of his true identity, which is as the Savior. Not just the healer, but the name Jesus means Savior.
It's more ultimate than that.
Yeah. It's a much bigger picture. So another important healing story, and the crowds just can't keep from talking about it.
Wow. So in all of this, we are continuing to see who is Jesus? What does that mean for us and for the people that we discover who he is, more and more of his identity. So then we go on to verses 32 through 34. So there's more healings at work here. So who are the people he heals?
Yeah, one more healing story, one more miracle story in this chapters 8 and 9. This time, a man who is unable to speak, and his circumstance is connected to some kind of demonic possession. And so this is one of those kind of double miracles. Remember with the man who was paralyzed, Jesus also forgave sins. Here, so there was a physical element and a spiritual dimension in both. And we've got a similar thing going on here where you've got the physical element of his inability to speak, but also the spiritual problem of demonic possession. And so Jesus addresses both of those by expelling the unclean spirit and by healing the man's speech issue. So shows authority in both of those areas. Yeah. The Pharisees weren't too happy with Jesus' ministry.
Yeah, they think he's a demon. Is that what that's saying? That they think that's where it's coming from?
They say by the ruler of demons, that would be the devil. He's casting out demons in the power of the ruler of demons.
Okay.
Jesus doesn't do that here, but on another occasion when Jesus was accused of this, he says, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You think I'm acting under the power of the prince of demons because I'm casting out demons? That seems kind of backwards, but he didn't get into that here, evidently. At least Matthew doesn't mention it. But again, like we saw the scribes accusing him of blasphemy, here we see the Pharisees accusing him of acting under demonic powers himself.
They're questioning who he is and what that means for the one. Yeah. And then we come upon after that sort of a summary of everything that we've seen in this chapter. So we've seen a lot of miracle stories and some lessons about discipleship too. So I love how it just starts that he went about all the cities and villages. He's teaching, he's proclaiming the good news, he's curing. So kind of those three things you said of teaching, preaching, and then also doing some miracle works as well. And then this beautiful verse 36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And I just love that image right there to think of Jesus having compassion for them. So what do you want to draw out here as we see these last few verses of chapter 9?
Yeah, you're right. These last few verses do two important things. I think they summarize all of chapter 8 and 9.
Okay.
First, by doing what you said, summarizing his ministry during this period. Back to the Sermon on the Mount, we know that Jesus was teaching and preaching and healing. And we've seen amazing examples of all three of those things. And all of that flowed out of Jesus' compassion. And there are a number of miracle stories where it specifies that he's acting out of compassion. When we get to the feeding stories later on, we're going to see that same compassion that Jesus is showing. But then the other thing that we've noticed lurking just kind of under the surface of all these miracle stories is Jesus' interest in training his disciples. And so chapter 9 actually ends on that note. In verse 37, he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And here he's switched metaphors. He's not talking about the crowds as sheep anymore, but as fruit that needs to be plucked, harvested, reaped. And he says, what I need are people who are willing to go out and do the harvesting, that is, share the good news of the coming kingdom. And so he's appealing to them to throw their lot in with his messianic ministry.
Okay. So the question is, will they come and follow? Will they participate in this work of Jesus? Wow, that's such a beautiful way to end that chapter. As we look back, we see sort of, again, going to those themes of authority and who Jesus is. So what have we seen so far in this chapter? What did Jesus exercise authority over?
Yeah, besides disease and illness, which are kind of a steady theme, and over unclean spirits, which is a theme as well. This chapter is interesting in that it emphasizes Jesus' authority over sin, the authority to forgive sins. And that is the actual phrase that Matthew used, the authority to forgive sins, which the scribes challenged. They said he didn't have it, but Jesus did.
Wow.
And the second thing that you mentioned so well in the story of the religious leader's daughter was authority over death itself.
And that's new, and that's big for us to recognize. And as we know, we'll continue to see that in the book of Matthew more and more. And then again, we're seeing all these different people who are coming up for Jesus to minister to. So tell us some about the variety of people that we see.
Yeah, it's similar to what we talked about last lesson in chapter 8, but there are Jews and Gentiles. There are men and women. Oh, in this case, there are adults and children. The 12-year-old, well, we think she was around 12, a small girl. There are sick and sinners on the one hand, and unclean. And then there are faithful people as well, like the bleeding woman was admired because of her faith. So all across the spectrum of the human condition, Jesus is reaching out and ministering to these people and calling them to be part of the kingdom. I love the way Matthew ends this chapter talking about two things: his compassion for the crowds and his challenge to the disciples to come and be part of the harvest. And those are two good things for us to go through the days of our lives, recognizing as well that we are people who are the beneficiaries of the deep compassion and mercy of God as shown through Jesus, but also people who've been given a real challenge to take up our role in that mission.
Yeah. What are we going to do with the compassion that we've been shown by Jesus? I love that. Wow. I know it's beautiful to think of where we see ourselves in this story once again, and not in a selfish way, but that we are being challenged by it, that we're thinking of what is our role when we hear the phrase of that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few, and that we're part of that invitation, that we can go forward and be part of that. Do you think there's a theme that comes out maybe about discipleship as we look at this chapter? How would you summarize that?
Well, one of the themes that we learn in this section is that discipleship is a choice. None of us is barred from a discipleship following that we want to pursue, and none of us is forced into it, because we've seen examples of people who are right on the edge of discipleship and choose not to follow, like the guy who wants to go back and prioritize his family over Jesus' mission. And then we meet just one chapter later, people like Matthew who are willing to leave income, occupation, security, maybe even family, and follow Jesus day by day.
I like that. Discipleship is a choice. And I think it's good we see to it the intentionality that we put into. It's not this passive choice that we just sort of put in with the rest of our lives and sort of, Jesus will sort of blend into whatever else I'm prioritizing, but that it changes everything. And that's just so powerful for us to see. We get to see some of the direct results of how it changes everything with some of these miracle stories of how it really was life-changing for many of them in a physical way, but that we know that it goes beyond that. It changes your priorities. It changes what you think is important and how you're going to live your life. And I think that's a great place for us to wrap up with this chapter as well, that we're continually seeing all of these stories through that lens of discipleship and that choice that we have before us, and that it's not a one-and-done choice, but that we're making that choice every day in our daily actions of how are we choosing Jesus? How are we acknowledging who Jesus is? And how are we, I love how you put it, how are we living out the compassion that's been shown to us? So who will you show compassion to this week? And how will you prioritize Jesus in your life? We hope you'll be back with us next week as we continue on in the book of Matthew.